Well, good evening. Hi, I'm Tom Crann from MPR News from All Things Considered, and it's great to have you here. Welcome to this virtual event, an MPR Connects event. Now, it feels like soon, very soon, we are on track to be able to meet again around the state. But until that time, it is just so great to have you here for the 12th annual MPR Connects event. Usually it takes place around the state, as it did last year with Paul Huttner, but we are delighted to have you with us virtually tonight. On a Friday night, now I'd expect nothing less from the MPR audience to give up part of their Friday night to hear about the Constitution and from our special guest tonight. Now, David Letterman has this Netflix series. It's called My Next Guest Needs No Introduction. And I suppose if you're a regular public radio listener and you're here tonight, our guest needs no introduction, so I will still give him one, but a very brief one, I promise. Peter Sagal's been a screenwriter, a playwright, and since 1998, I'm amazed, it's 23 years, he's been involved with Wait, Don't Tell Me, and host of the show for most of that time. I believe he started as a panelist in those early days. You hear it Saturdays at 11, Sundays at 1 here on MPR News. And Peter has an abiding interest in the Constitution, and he's going to bring us, share that interest with us tonight. You may know him from his PBS show, Constitution USA. It's online. I just rewatched it in the last couple of weeks or so, and it is certainly worth your time. It's really an excellent show. In some of the public information about this, Peter, we were told you're going to address the Constitution with a dash of humor. So we're going to hold you to the dash of humor and let you determine just exactly how much that is. He describes himself as an amateur enthusiast of the Constitution. So please welcome Peter Sagal. It is our pleasure. Peter, good to have you here tonight.
Thank you, Tom. And thank you, everybody, for watching. I assume you're out there somewhere.
Yeah.
Something Tom didn't mention is that I have a connection to Minnesota. I lived in Minnesota between 1992 and 1995 in Minneapolis near Powderhorn Park. In fact, the very first public radio network I ever joined as a paying member was Minnesota Public Radio. So,
Wow. All right.
I'm considering this just a pledge benefit that, they said to me in 25 years, we'll put you on something called Zoom.
We'll ask you to work for us. Exactly.
Thank you. And the other connection, which I think is more important for this evening, is that as was mentioned, I did a documentary for PBS called Constitution USA. It aired a while ago now, 8 years in 2013. But that documentary was in fact co-produced by TTW. I'm sorry, not TTW, Twin Cities Public TV.
Twin Cities Public TV, TPT or
TPT. TTW is here in Chicago. Too many T's,
That's
too many
right.
public
Yes.
radio. You understand.
Right.
So it's the Minnesota connections go deep, both in my life and for this evening's topic. That documentary, like I said, was a 4-part documentary about the Constitution, and it was conceived as a way of bringing civics education, civics documentaries out of the era of at least my childhood, which was basically very boring stuff involving paintings of founders in wigs and hosiery, handing parchments to each other in oak-lined rooms, and boxes indicating the executive and the legislature and arrows pointing, and it was all very dull. We wanted to show the viewer, to explore with the viewer how the Constitution actually lives and is relevant today. In fact, one of the metaphors, there will be a lot of metaphors in pop culture during my remarks, but one of the metaphors we used in our documentary was that the Constitution is like the Force from Star Wars. It surrounds everything, binds us all together, whether we can see it or not. Now, the documentary is out there. You can watch it. It's got a lot of fun things in it. It's got me in a motorcycle, if that's exciting. But making the documentary, which for me was sort of a labor both of love and of curiosity. I'm not a law professor. I didn't go to law school. I'm sorry, Mom. But I was deeply interested in civics, and making the documentary made me even more interested. I talked to so many interesting people. But there was something that happened just in passing that became sort of one of my obsessions. The thing that happened was I was talking to a very well-known scholar named Akil Reed-Amar. He's featured in the documentary sort of as our resident expert. And he said in passing, the Soviet Union had a Bill of Rights. Turns out they did, as does to this day the Communist government of China. They have bills of rights. They have amazing bills of rights that guarantee all kinds of rights. And theirs obviously are a joke, right? I mean, they have no freedoms. The Soviet Union certainly didn't. Wasn't worth the paper it was printed on when they printed it. And that started this sort of intellectual journey for me, which is like they had a Bill of Rights and a constitution that's useless. We've had one that has worked more or less. How has it worked? And for many years, I went around the country and I would give a talk, which I will summarize in the next 45 seconds to a minute, boil it down. And the talk was really pursuing that question. Why does our Constitution work? Why has it worked to this point when other countries and other constitutions have not? And I talked about a lot of things. I talked about the fact that our Constitution is not only the oldest extant constitution of a democratic society, it's also the shortest written one. And I talked about the fact that that's not unrelated, that its brevity and its sparseness has helped it as we have moved through time and had different things we needed to do because it specifies so little. We've been able to improvise on its basis. I talk about that. But after talking to a lot of different people with a lot of, what's the word, incompatible opinions about what the Constitution means, after discovering that most people don't know what's actually in the Constitution, other than this idea that it basically guarantees them the right to do whatever it is they may want to be doing at the moment, I finally came to the conclusion that the Constitution works, not because of its genius design. In fact, there are a lot of problems with its design. We can talk about that later if you like. Not because of the genius of the founders, not because of a particular kind of Western creed, but because the Constitution is the basis of a kind of civic religion. And that civic religion is actually laid out not in the text of the Constitution per se, but in the preamble, which any lawyer will tell you means nothing legally, but means everything in terms of our national creed. I recently wrote an essay to accompany a hand-printed version of the preamble from Arian Press in San Francisco. And what you see in the preamble, if you read it, we the people, in order to form a more perfect union, to ordain and establish this, we can all sing it, right? Those of us who grew up with, there it is. Those of us who grew up with Schoolhouse Rock can sing it. What that basically says is it says, whatever the details of the document that are about to follow, we are doing this because we, the people of the United States, are interested in self-government. We are going to govern ourselves, and we're going to do it for our mutual benefit. And in those, I think, 52 words is this basic idea that I then, in my prior talk, prior to recent events, would try to define as our civic religion. What does it mean, this American civic religion, this thing that binds people from all over the country and all over from wherever their country or culture of origin, it binds us together? What is it? And I would talk at that time, back in those days, about the fact that here in America, we believe in the rule of law. We believe in settling our disputes through legal means, not through violence, which had been the historical norm pretty much for all of human history. We respect officials who are duly elected. We respect the sanctity of elections. We do, and I would talk about it in vague terms. And I would say that the reason that our country has succeeded for as long as it has is because a critical mass, a sufficient percentage of the population, including our most powerful officials, have believed firmly in this civic religion and have been willing to sacrifice their own wants, needs, desires, or advantage in order to hold to the tenets of the religion. And I would mention in passing that as long as that was the case, our country would continue. For all its flaws, it would continue to be a successful and the first example of democracy on this planet, as long as we had that critical mass who believed it, especially the people in power who were granted power under this Constitution. And perhaps at some time I might have commented how bad it would be if we ever were ruled by people who did not believe in this civic religion. And then I would say, thank you very much for coming, and we'd go and have a drink in the bar. And then 2016 happened, that election and subsequent events. And I think that, like a lot of people, it really shook my understanding of what I had thought this country was, what I had thought people believed, it shook my belief in that shared religion, right? Almost as if I thought we all agreed on this, but apparently you guys don't. And it really threw me for a loop. And like a lot of people, I'm sure, including many people, if not all of you who are watching, I really had to do kind of almost like a vision quest, a search to figure out what exactly had happened. And when you boil down the question to its essence, it comes down to this. Was the rise and election of Donald Trump a bizarre historical anomaly, a strange eruption of craziness into history, to paraphrase another writer, Ron Rosenbaum? Or was it the natural end result of the historical progress of American democracy? When historians look back on this bizarre period that we are still living through, will they say, well, it naturally followed from X, Y, and Z that this would happen? Here we can lay it out. Or will they say, I don't know what happened? And so I really became curious, and I became also very curious as to whether my understanding of the Constitution that I just sort of very briefly laid out for you was actually true. Was I right to believe in this civic virtue and this civic religion? And to put it mildly, I haven't come to any firm conclusions. But like I'm sure, again, a lot of you, I did a lot of reading and a lot of thinking. And my thinking about the Constitution and about American civics has changed and grown, and I think deepened, I hope. And to talk about everything that I have learned would take far more time than we have tonight. But so what I'm going to do is I'm going to focus on three very important things that I read over the course of the last few years that have really shaped my current thinking. And those things are a sentence, an article, and a book. A sentence, an article, and a book. And I will go through them in order. The sentence was in an article in the Atlantic magazine by Yuri Rosenberg. And the sentence is, democracy depends on the consent of the losers. And when I read that sentence, I was like, that's it. That's the statement of that civic religion that I was trying to define, the absolute nugget of meaning upon which everything else in our constitutional system revolves. Democracy depends on the consent of the losers. I'm Jewish, and in the Jewish religion, we have this thing called the Shema, which is this very brief statement of faith that everything else flows from. Islam has a similar thing. There is no God but God, and Muhammad is his prophet. It all boils down to that. Everything else follows. So as with those religions, in my civic religion, the single sentence is democracy depends on the consent of the losers. What that means, very obviously, it's obvious now, is that if you lose an election, no matter how much you really wanted to win that election, no matter how badly you think the guy or gal who won will do now that they won the job, you say, people have spoken, and you agree to lose. You say, I lost. You have power. You respect the power of the person who won. In fact, if we want to go back to the Civil War, and we will, the actual cause of the Civil War was not slavery, although that obviously was the basic issue. But the specific cause was that the South did not respect the winner of a free and fair election, the presidential election of 1860. They did not consent to lose. They left instead. That's why Lincoln fought them, because he knew, being Lincoln, that that was the essence of American democracy. When you lose an election, you don't get to say, I'm sorry, I'm leaving. We're not a part of this anymore. You say, oh, we lost. We'll get you next time. Now, like I said, that has been, shall we say, vividly illustrated by the president's attempts to overthrow and undo the results of the 2020 presidential election, starting before that election, continuing after it, and climaxing with the sacking of the Capitol on January 6th. So obviously my point has been made, I think. Sorry, thank you. I wish you hadn't been so helpful. But it actually goes even deeper than that. You may remember the first time that President Trump was impeached. There were two impeachment articles of impeachment. The first one had to do, of course, with his misuse of federal funds to pressure Ukraine to investigate his opponent. You know that story, whatever you think of it, there it happened. The second one was about him not cooperating with congressional oversight. And that actually was the more important article, though no one believed it at the time, and I couldn't convince anybody of it. because everybody was so concerned with what the president had done in regard to Ukraine. But it's really important because what happened was in 2018, the Democrats won the House of Representatives, again, in a free and fair election. And President Trump did not consent to have lost that election. He never gave them, accorded to them, the authority that they had duly won. They said, we are now the House of Representatives. We are duly elected. We have responsibility. We have power. Please show us your tax returns. Please show us these documents. Please send these people to testify for our investigation. And the president and his White House simply said, no, we don't believe you have any authority. No. And what we found out was that if he says no, there's not a lot to be done about it. Turns out our whole government has been operating on an honor system this whole time. In fact, the only thing that our written constitution gives the Congress to do in the case, in the event of such a remarkable defiance of, I don't know what you want to call it, respect for democracy, the only power they have is to impeach him. That's the only power they were given. There's nothing in the Constitution about prosecuting the president, about investigating the president. The Congress has no army. The Congress has no courts. The Congress doesn't have a police force. They can't send somebody over to raid the White House and seize his files. All they can do, the only thing they got is impeach him. And they did. And it didn't work because apparently Republicans in the Congress at that time decided it was that it was more important to do what the president wanted to protect his power or maybe protect their own jobs than actually, I don't know, protect and defend the Constitution of the United States. So again, the sentence, democracy depends on the consent of the losers. And that's one of the things that has really been put at risk by the events of the last few years, continuing into the present day with the continuing efforts across the United States to restrict the right of voters. That's the sentence. The article is called John Roberts and the Return of the Redemption Court. It's by Adam Serwer, also published in The Atlantic. The Atlantic is a great magazine, by the way. You should all read it. The phrase redemption in the context of U.S. history might be unusual to you or unfamiliar to me. It was to me. And as a side note, one of the things I have discovered and learned in the last 5 years is how much I did not know prior to these last years, how much I was not taught. Growing up in New Jersey in the 70s and 80s, how fraudulent my education was as to the actuality of U.S. history. For example, I was actually taught, and I lived in a state that won the Civil War, that it was fought over states' rights without a lot of inquiry as to what the states wanted to do with that right, the state's right to do what. We were taught that Reconstruction was the federal occupation of the South after the Civil War, which was oppressive and awful. We heard something about carpetbaggers who were bad for some reason. I don't know exactly why they were bad, but they were bad, and the South didn't like the carpetbaggers. And finally, the Reconstruction ended and everything went back and we were all friends again. Redemption was the end of Reconstruction. Redemption was the term used by those people in the South who wanted to undo Reconstruction and wanted to end it. To talk about redemption requires me to talk about something else that I learned about the Constitution in my journey of education doing the documentary, and that is the importance of the Reconstruction Amendments, specifically the 14th. And parenthetically, there's a really good documentary on Netflix right now called Amend, which is about the 14th Amendment and its importance. It's a long topic, the importance of the 14th Amendment. But people refer to the Reconstruction Amendments and their passage in the years after the Civil War as the second founding of the United States. And I've come to believe that the people who are responsible for those amendments, the radical Republicans of the post-war era, actually deserve as much credit for creating the country that we now have as our actual founders, the guys who are on the money. And this is why, to be very simplistic about it, the original Constitution and the Bill of Rights limited the government. Negative rights. The government can't impose on you. It can't prevent you from doing whatever. It can't take away your right to this, that, the other thing. Free speech, assembly, bearing arms. The 14th Amendment for the first time in our nation, empowered the government to guarantee your rights. It made the government an actor in terms of making sure that everyone got, to use the phrase, the due process of the law. That was extraordinarily important. In fact, that concept of what rights are and what the government's role is in guaranteeing those rights is basically what lies behind what we now think of as our free society. Many of the rights that you feel you have, rights of privacy, rights of association, the right to marry who you want, come not from the original Constitution, but the 14th Amendment. So that's great. And that's a very important thing, I think, for everybody to understand how important the 14th Amendment is, how it reconceived what our nation would be and what our government would be for. The thing that nobody told me, though, in my education, all through college, was that very soon after the passage of the 14th Amendment, it was essentially written out of the Constitution. There's a very important Supreme Court case, which I learned about from Mr. Adam Serwer. Again, I was like 53 years old, and I finally heard about this. United States versus Cruikshank, 1876. That was as important a case in the history of our nation as Dred Scott or Plessy v. Ferguson, and very similar to those. Because what it basically did, without getting into the details of it, which are gruesome, is it basically erased the 14th Amendment. It said the 14th Amendment did not mean what it clearly meant. It basically said that the government of the United States, the federal government, was powerless to prevent the white former slave owners of the American South, the former Confederate States, from basically re-enslaving the Black population, from stripping them of all civil rights, from stripping them of the right to vote, the right to work, the right to do anything they liked without fear of violent death. The federal government decided, well, no, the 14th Amendment, which was designed specifically to prevent that, does not, in fact, prevent it. And that led to the period of time that we call Jim Crow, that we don't really talk about enough, and haven't, I think, until recently. Perhaps you've heard someone say something to the effect of, you know, the United States, yes, it was a slave state, but we've done so much for African-American citizens. They say something, and I've read this quite literally. They say, well, of course, we fought the Civil War and did away with slavery, and then we passed the Civil Rights Act in 1965, and et cetera. Between the first clause and the second, the end of the Civil War and the passage of the Civil Rights Act, there's a whole century. Multiple generations of Black Americans grew, lived, and died without any civil rights to speak of, because they lived in essentially an apartheid state. That for most of our history, this was not a true democracy. It was a democracy for most white people. And the millions of Black people in this country had no rights to speak of. And that when we look back on our nation and we think about us being the arsenal of democracy in World War II, say, and all the freedoms that we believe that we have stood for, we must understand and confront right now that those freedoms that we so celebrate, and there were the freedoms, by the way, that both attracted my ancestors, Russian Jews from Eastern Europe, to this country in the beginning of the 20th century, those freedoms that allowed them to flourish and thrive as most of your ancestors did, if they came from wherever, Germany, Scandinavia, wherever. Those freedoms were real. Those freedoms were unique in the world. Those freedoms brought the huddled masses to us and allowed their descendants like me to thrive. But those freedoms were not general. They were not extended to Black people for most of this country's history. It's not something we talk about enough. And I think that as we look at the question of whether or not the last 5 or 6 years of our civics are an anomaly or proceed from the actual history of the United States, we need first to be brutally honest about what that history really is and has been. So I've mentioned the sentence, I've mentioned the article, and I'll now mention the book. And the book is Isabel Wilkerson's book, Caste, C-A-S-T-E, a caste system. Ms. Wilkerson won all the awards, rightfully so, for her book, The Warmth of Other Suns, about the great migration of Black people from the South to cities like Chicago, where I am, Minneapolis as well. But in this book, Caste, she casts American racial history, if you would excuse the expression, in terms of a caste system. And that explanation I found extremely powerful in that it helps me to understand things that I didn't actually understand. It's a way of looking at American history in which things make sense. In fact, I mentioned earlier that I thought our Constitution was like the Force from Star Wars. To invoke another pop culture metaphor, caste in America is like the Matrix. It's a system that controls us even if we don't know about it, even if we want to pretend that it doesn't. To do a very powerful and important and well-researched book, Some Injustice, I will summarize it very briefly, in which that her thesis is that we do not have technically a racist society in America. We have a caste society, which uses physical characteristics, which we call race, as a marker of caste, right? Many of you perhaps have heard of the complicated caste systems of India, with the Brahmins on top and the untouchables below. Many other intermediate castes between them. And she makes a very convincing comparison of their system to ours. There are so many similarities. There are large similarities in that the upper caste has access to wealth and opportunity and education that the lower caste does not. There are similarities in the way that the lower castes are delegated to do dirty or filthy jobs that need to be done, but other people don't want to do. There are very weird specifics. For example, in caste systems like theirs and ours, there's an obsession with purity, especially sexual purity. She writes really powerfully about how for most of our American history, Black people, the lower caste in this country, were perceived to be physically unclean, such that if they were to swim in a public swimming pool, the public swimming pool would have to be emptied. That happened a lot. And the reason it's such an important book, and I think everybody should read it and consider its arguments, is because I said it makes things make sense in a way that they don't. For example, one of the things that we've seen in the news are people who seem to be doing and saying racist things, but say in all sincerity that they're not racist. Oh, no, I'm not a racist. I judge people by the content of their character. I have many friends who are Black people. I admire Black athletes or actors or musicians, and they say, how can I be racist if my favorite athlete is Michael Jordan or LeBron James, and my favorite musician is Prince or Beyonce? And the answer is because they're not married to this idea of racial inferiority per se. They're married to the caste system. They're perfectly happy to admire, to be friends with, to celebrate people of all races, creeds, and colors, just as they say they are, as long as the caste system is maintained. And in a weird way, finally bringing us back to the events of the last 5 years, I think what we saw was the revelation that caste system, that hierarchy in our society, was in the end a deeper religion, a more sincere belief than that civic religion that I mentioned earlier. That people will be willing to sacrifice those civics that I mentioned, the consent of the loser, the rule of law, in order to preserve that caste system. Or maybe better to put it is they would be willing to throw away those civic ideals in order to preserve the caste system if they perceive the caste system as being under threat. I mean, one of the things that's amazing about it is we've seen people literally willing to die or consign their fellow citizens to death rather than give up that caste system. It's kind of chilling when you think about it. And once you start thinking about it, it's hard not to stop. It's hard to stop. I mean, for example, I just watched Saving Private Ryan for the first time in a long time the other night, and I was watching it, and I was thinking to myself, my God, here's a movie based in fact about people who went over to fight, to risk their lives, to die, to fight fascism and racism in the form of Nazi Germany, one of the greatest evils that has ever existed. And they did it sincerely because they believed they were fighting for civilization and freedom and democracy. There are no Black people in that movie because among its historical accuracies is the fact that that army that went to fight the most virulent form of racist hatred the world has ever seen was itself segregated. That all of those people, most of them, who went to fight and die to preserve freedom were absolutely committed to our racial caste system. And that contradiction is at the heart of our history. And I think it's what we saw erupt in the last 5 years. I just went over my time, but let me try to answer something and maybe cheer us up a little bit with what I think is going to happen or how I think we can fix this, how I think we can beat back the threat. And I should say, by the way, that I'm sure that to some of you, my comments tonight have seemed very partisan. If you think that I do not think that President Trump was a very good president, you are correct. If you think that I thought he was a great threat to America and its civics and its freedoms, you are correct. I don't think that's partisan. I don't think I'm arguing for the Democrats against the Republicans in saying that. I think I'm arguing for democracy, small d, against its enemies. Once we get all this fixed, I'd be happy to go back and have nice arguments about things like marginal tax rates and infrastructure spending and healthcare and stuff like that. That's fine. We can argue about that all the time. I think the emergency that we're confronting is something more serious than any of those, what we think of as political issues. So just to finish up quickly, what should we do if we are in fact under this threat, this deep, deep threat to American civics that we saw so vividly on the 6th of January, 2021? First, I think we really have to do everything we can to protect the integrity of the elections. And I mean that seriously, as opposed to the way some other people mean it. And that basically means to guarantee equal access to the ballot for everybody. Every citizen of this country should be able to vote where they live once, and they should be able to do that as easily as can be made possible. And that we should resist any attempt to limit the right to vote, to prevent directly or indirectly any population from having access to the ballot box. The freer and fairer our elections, the more legitimate the results, the more it will be possible to respect the results, even if you lose. I also believe, parenthetically, that we need to end the Electoral College for a lot of reasons. I think that would result in freer and fairer elections with better results, because a lot of people who are disenfranchised because they don't live in swing states and they're in the minority would then all of a sudden be able to weigh in an equal way as their fellow citizens on who should be president. And finally, we just kind of have to wait, because as the country moves forward in time, new populations rise up, old populations fade away. And I think that the change that is coming in terms of our demographics is inevitable. And that, more than anything else, will continue to degrade this caste system that I think has determined our nation's history to this point. And I am looking forward to my son, who was just born, growing up in a world that is in a country, I should say, that is a lot less regimented by caste than it is now and has been in the past, and thus does not induce the same kind of panic when that caste system is threatened by the specter of democracy. That's all I have to say. I hope I wasn't too depressing, and I'd be happy to take any of your questions you might like about this or goofy fart jokes, which is usually what I'm known for.
You can hear me, Peter?
Yes.
Yes, good. That's all. No one needs to see me. I'm on the radio. Hearing is just fine. It is my medium, audio and hearing. When there's video involved, it gets confusing. Here is what I want to bring up. So things that you mentioned there, the caste system from Wilkerson's book, and this idea that you brought up is very powerful. And I've heard her speak about it, but I haven't yet read the book. But there are things that are basically underline that system, the Electoral College, for example. So does the Constitution allow us to deal with this problem of a caste system, or does it reinforce it?
The Constitution,
Yeah.
originally, was a document that supported slavery. It did so
Yeah.
implicitly and explicitly in the Three-Fifths Clause, which we can get
Mhm.
into, in the
Yep.
Fugitive Slave Clause. And that's why the Reconstruction Amendments are so important, because they basically undid that aspect and rewrote it. A new birth of freedom, to borrow a phrase.
Mhm.
All the tools we need are there. Remember that the entire Jim Crow period, which again ended after I was born, uh, so it ended like in my lifetime,
Yeah.
was a violation of the letter of the Constitution, of the 14th Amendment. So, I mean, I started by saying that the other countries had, Soviet Russia, Communist China, had constitutions, bills of rights that were ignored. And then I would say, well, ours hasn't been ignored. But the fact of the matter is that for a significant portion of our population, it has been. So there's nothing in the Constitution that would prevent us to end this system, to extend rights to those who don't have it, and continue in the journey that we've been on in the course of my lifetime of expanding rights to all. It's just a question of what we're going to do with it. I mean, one of the things I've always said is that the founders never promised us a rose garden. They never said you will have a good society, you will have a bad society, you will have a fair society, you will have a just society. They said you now have the tools to decide for yourself what you want it to be. And that's what we have done consistently, for good or bad. And so we can make a different decision.
To that aim, there is talk, and a lot of it doesn't get, we don't hear much about it, but there's been talk for years of the possibility of another constitutional convention, because that's in there, and certainly when it comes to amendments. And do you welcome that, or do you fear it, or do you think we should welcome it or fear it, given the partisan nature of our discourse and the bifurcated nature of the discourse?
It entirely depends on what you're going to do with that convention. It has been historically, with based on one example, a terrible idea to legislate via constitutional amendment. The exception was prohibition. It was a disaster.
Mhm.
We
Mhm.
shouldn't do that. We should only amend the Constitution to improve our system of governments, not the decisions we make. The Constitution does not tell us how to live. Again, gives us the tools to decide as a people democratically how we're going to live. So great, terrible things can be done without constitutional amendment, and great things can be done without them as well. The one constitutional amendment that I said I would be in favor of is undoing the Electoral College. Some people think that the Electoral College, and have argued, is a legacy of our foundation in slavery, that it was intended to support and extend the institution of slavery. There's a debate about that. I don't think it was intended to do that originally, although it has been used that way specifically into the 20th century. It was originally designed because, frankly, the founders didn't really trust, these illiterate people they're giving political power to directly elect the president, because, how would they know who the presidential candidates were? It was a dumb idea. And we need to get rid of it, not for issues of racial justice, although that might be a knock-on effect. We need to get rid of it because if you're a Republican who lives in California or a Democrat who lives in Alabama, you have no say in the presidential election. Nobody cares what you think. I live in Illinois. My Republican friends in Illinois have no say because this is a blue state. You guys live in a semi-swing state, so it's a little more interesting. But everybody should have equal say in who gets to be president, even if you are the political minority in your state. And if that were to happen, it's also possible our politics would moderate, because it would move toward the center of opinion if more people's opinions matter.
Okay. I was fascinated with the fourth of your episodes of Constitution USA, the PBS series we've talked about. And it's called Will It Last? And it's about
Yes.
the durability of the Constitution and the idea of mutual consent, that everyone has to agree. And as you put it, everyone has to agree. Who loses has to step aside, and whether that's a court case, you need to abide by
Mm-hmm.
the rule of the judge, or you need to abide by the elections that have consequences. What we saw, some people look to what we saw with the Donald Trump's denial of the election results, followed by the insurrection on January 6th. And they look at it and they say, well, you know, it still works. The Constitution may have been bent, but it didn't break. So how would you update that episode?
Well, it is true. And there was a moment in which I think everybody could take some solace in the fact, as the people, the actors, I mean, the senators themselves congratulated themselves. We went forward with democracy. And I
They
guess
got
that's
back to
true.
business by what,
They
8 o'clock that night,
yeah,
right?
no, that was good.
Yeah.
And I think that was important that they did it.
Right.
I also think that we should not dismiss or let go unappreciated the many officials, judges, election officials, who stood up for the sanctity of the vote and the electoral process in the face of intense pressure. I mean, I don't know what I would do if the president of the United States called to threaten me if I didn't do something he wanted. But these people, many of them, including people who had nothing to gain politically from doing so, stood fast. Also, the many judges, including, of course, as people commented, Republican judges, Trump appointed judges, who stood fast and said, no, these claims have no merit. They are not legally valid, et cetera. And those were all really, really good things, as was shall we say, the revulsion, you know. One could almost say that there was a moment where you can almost argue, well, it was good that January 6th happened because it was kind of an infection that strengthened our immune system. We understand what the threat is, and now we will respond. However, like I'm sure, like a lot of people who are watching tonight, what's happened since then has been kind of dispiriting. There have been the widespread, we've all been paying attention to them, effects to efforts to restrict the vote, to suppress the vote, based entirely on fraudulent claims of fraud in the last election that have been imposed almost entirely, I think entirely, by Republican legislatures and leaders in order to the generous way to put it is to assuage the concerns of their voters. Let's leave it at that.
Okay.
And there has also been, even more terrifyingly, a attempt to erase the meaning of January 6th from history. People are now saying, well, it wasn't so bad, or well, it was, what did I don't know, some right-wing person say, Tucker Carlson, I think, they just strolled in. It was the doors were open. And of course, I think, as I referenced earlier, I was taught a false version of the history of the Civil War and Reconstruction, because that was the version of history that our ancestors agreed upon because it made everybody feel better about what had actually happened. Nobody wanted to talk about the fact that they just sold all the ex-slaves, recently freed slaves, down the river. So they came up with this different story. And I'm concerned that that's already happening. We're coming up with a different story, a more pleasing story about what happened on January 6th than the terror that we basically almost lost our 238-year-old experiment.
What went through your head that day, January 6th, watching, listening, however you heard the news?
It was stunning. It was, one of the things that I think, one of the things that you could talk about forever is just the psychological reactions to current events and how puzzling they've been. How we've so often looked at things that seemed impossible happening and find itself hard to believe it. The president started decrying the legitimacy of the election before it even happened. And he continued doing it after the election in a way that has never been done in American history. That is an absolute violation of the basic core tenet, the consent of the loser. And yet, weirdly, no one took him seriously, or very seriously. You may remember that very famous anonymous quote in the Washington Post. Just humor him for a while. What's the harm? Said some senior advisor. And so I honestly believe, even up to the moment where his rally goers turned and started walking to the Capitol, maybe even after that moment, many people just didn't think it would amount to anything. It was just another Trump rally, another big demonstration of enthusiasm, and it would amount to nothing. And then seeing the images, let me put it this way. As some of you may know, I was at the Boston Marathon bombing in 2013.
Mhm.
I was very near the explosions. And one of the things about that event was how hard it was for me to accept what I had just seen. I
Yeah.
couldn't believe it. I literally couldn't believe my own eyes. What I had just seen clearly was an explosion of some kind. And yet I kept trying to deny it, even though I was in the middle of it. It really wasn't until later that I was able to comprehend it. And
Yeah.
I can say for myself personally, and maybe nationally, we all had that reaction. We were all watching these yahoos smash the doors of the US Capitol and charge through it. And it was hard to believe it was happening. So I can't say I reacted with horror. I reacted with sort of disbelief. I
Yeah.
think that was, I'm guessing that was fairly common.
Yeah. Let's get to some questions here. And boy, there's just so much, Peter, that we could
Yeah. And
talk about.
I'm already seeing them line up, and I
Oh,
apologize to everybody for
exactly.
not thinking about it.
Let's do that. Do you see them? Here is one, and the names were on some of these, but anyway, I don't know who this is from, but you've talked a lot about Black Americans. What do you have to say about, for example, Indigenous Americans,
I,
Latinx Americans, and/or recent refugees when
I
it comes
think
to the caste context?
to the extent that was a criticism, my remarks, I accept it because it's not as simple as white and black. In my view, and again, I follow entirely on Isabel Wilkerson, is that they fit into the caste system. The Indian caste system, to which she makes comparisons, has multiple levels. There are castes that are different but are of equivalent stature. We have a similar thing. Um, Generally speaking, white Christians are the upper caste, but there are many other castes that are subservient to them, but in different ways. Asian Americans have their own caste, but there are different statuses within them. Recent immigrants are lower than established immigrants among Asians. I'm a Jew. Jewish Americans are in a caste. We're pretty high up, but we're not the highest. We're a couple steps down. Native Americans have traditionally been very near the bottom, if not actually at the bottom. Recent refugees, Muslims are their own caste. And again, it's incredibly complex. It's not. It has happened that castes have combined. I mean, for example, as many people know, back in the 19th century, the Irish were a despised minority. Central Europeans, Czechs were a despised minority. Southern Europeans were a despised minority. Italian people could tell you about how their grandfather, or maybe at this point, great grandfather, was discriminated against, called names when they first came to this country. And those people have, for the most part, been absorbed into the upper caste. But so it's complex and it's changing and it's real, and we're all involved in it, whether we want to be or not.
Here's a very nice comment here from Chris Morris, and I'm saying it even though it's a bit immodest, but I'm saying it as much for you, Peter, as for me. Thank you, gentlemen. I'm sure I'm not the only one who wants to point out how unique the experience is to put a face to two so beloved voices. And I always say to people, like if I meet them at, say, at the state fair, sorry to disappoint you, but that's the best I can do. At some point, the limiting of our traditional media outlets, the rise of social media we've seen that as well. And increasing wealth gaps and the distrust of education and expertise. All of that, Chris sees as fuel for the current situation. So, what can we hope for to try to ease this turbulent time? There's a lot there.
There's a lot there. How do things get better? I'll tell you one thing. It's not going to happen on Twitter, where I spend most of my
Right.
time. So don't take that as a criticism that I don't share in.
Yeah.
One of the things I would always say about democracy, even American democracy, even before recent events, was that nobody ever said, as I think that I said, that the founders never promised us a rose garden. They also never said it was going to be easy. And it never has been. Actual change in this country is very, very hard. It was almost designed that way. The flip side of stability is how difficult it is to make changes, even if those changes are necessary. So if good things are going to come out of the last 5 years, it will not happen automatically. Let me put it this way, and I think I can put a button on it this way.
Yeah.
Martin Luther King used to quote. It wasn't his. He was actually quoting an earlier reverend, and the quote was very, very famous. The moral arc of the universe is long, but it bends towards justice.
Justice. Yeah.
President Obama used to quote that a lot.
Right.
I don't think that's right. I don't think that the moral arc of the universe bends anywhere on itself. Certainly, we have, if anybody who believed in the inevitable progress toward greater civil liberties, greater inclusion, et cetera, has had a bit of a surprise. But so it doesn't do anything by itself, but it can be bent. It can be bent. And when it has been bent towards justice, it has been bent by people putting their shoulders to it. People like Martin Luther King and his many, many, many allies. And I think that anybody sitting here tonight, frustrated about what has happened, worried about what might happen next, has to accept as a starting principle that nothing will change for the better unless somebody very much like you puts their shoulder to that particular arc of justice and starts pushing.
Bends it.
Yes.
Yeah. I'm going to throw something in. Is what we have seen so often during President Trump's administration. We heard that all the norms were being violated. The way a president behaves, and I am a big believer in. And I've been criticized for it when I do interviews in civility and in a sort of mutual respect. And it's not just because it's polite, but it is polite.
Right.
But civility and these norms also have to do with this mutual agreement, this mutual consent to me about how the Constitution works. If we don't have those norms, then that mutual respect and mutual consent begins to fall apart. Do you think that's
Absolutely? And I think there are a lot of analogies to understand it. One is athletics. I mean, I love baseball. And when my team plays, I want them to win, but I want them to win playing by the rules, right? Because if they don't play by the rules, I mean, if my team, instead of playing the game of baseball in the field, just grabs their bats, goes over to the other dugout and beats everybody into unconscious and then claims victory, they won, but something important has been lost. That's one way of looking at it. Another way of looking at it is civility is an exercise in reestablishing the basis of respect, right? I'll make I once studied the martial art of Aikido at the Twin Cities Aikido Center, which used to be up in St. Paul on University Avenue. And when you do a Japanese martial art or any Asian martial art, there's a lot of bowing and politesse. You say certain things, you bow very deeply, you obey very careful rules. And it was explained to me once that the reason you follow all those rules is because we're engaging in violent acts with each other. And so those acts of courtesy and civility are an extremely important control on what we're about to do, right? We're in a weird way, it's like shaking hands or knocking gloves before a fight. You're like, okay, we're going to fight, but we're going to start by acknowledging that we're friends and that we're in this together and that we're going to proceed on mutual respect. And I think that those norms have an incredibly important role to play in our civics. And when you treat people with contempt, as our president used to do quite a lot, it strikes a far deeper blow at our government than mere issues of politesse.
Yeah. Here is Brian Calandra says, no, let's do this one by Michael first. It's going to be tough to get to all these, but Peter, how optimistic are you about jettisoning the Electoral College in our lifetimes? And it takes what, 2/3 of the states? So many of them.
2/3 of the states. It'll take, I think, 2/3 of the Congress and then 2/3 of the states.
Yeah.
The only way it'll happen is if the party who is at the moment, and it has changed over time. Right now, it's the Republicans who feel they have the advantage. That will change again. That when the party at whom has the momentary advantage agrees to do away with it. And acts of political sacrifice in our country are rare. They've happened. It almost happened, actually. I was amazed to discover this. It happened in my lifetime. There was a very popular, almost successful attempt to do away with the Electoral College after the election of 1968 because people were so freaked out by how well George Wallace had done. And so there was a movement. I can't remember I think it was Birch Bay. Yes, Birch Bay led this. We got to get rid of the Electoral College because we can't let somebody like George Wallace get to be president. And he had a huge amount of popular support, and it was brought down by Southern segregationists who have been fighting a rearguard action against the popular will for a long time. And they understood then what has become clear now is that right now and has trended is the Electoral College has been a bulwark of conservative politics in a way that it wasn't designed to be, but that's how it's been working now. Mm-hmm. But like I said, and it will benefit Republicans. I don't understand why all the Republicans who live in California or New York State or Illinois or Oregon and Washington, there's a lot of them, why they don't want to get rid of it so they get to have a say, but they don't listen to me.
We listen to you, Peter Sagal. We listen to you on Wait, Don't Tell Me, and I can't let the hour go without one question about.
By all means, let's lighten the mood. Damn it.
Yes, let's lighten the mood just a bit, and that is for the past year you have had to do the show without a live audience. You're not in your normal theater in Chicago or wherever else you go. And what has that experience been like? And when do you foresee being able to do it with actual people, with people actually laughing?
Old school fans of my show, people who go back to the very beginning, will remember that we didn't do the show with a live audience most weeks. It was designed as a studio show. So being forced to go back to that, and I am sitting right where I record my weekly radio show. This is the microphone I do it with. At first was really weird. We miss you. We were talking beforehand about how weirdly uncomfortable I am when I can't see the people I'm performing for. But we've adjusted, and we have this tremendous advantage that, say, someone like Stephen Colbert or other people who do my job haven't had, which is that we are an ensemble show. So even though we haven't had an audience to try to amuse and engage with, we've had each other. Mm-hmm. And we've gotten better at it. I think the show has, if we've gained anything, there's a certain feel of intimacy, which I hope is pleasurable to the audience. I personally, though, cannot wait to get back in front of all of you. I have very fond memories of doing the show all over the Twin Cities and the Fitz, as we mentioned, plus larger theaters over in Minneapolis. I don't know if anybody was there one of the last times we did it when I had that enormous shiner back in 2013.
I don't remember that.
Yeah, it was fun. I did the whole show in sunglasses. And as of right now, we are scheduled to do our first show in front of an audience at an outdoor venue in Philadelphia in July. And then another one at Tanglewood in Western Massachusetts in August. And I hope those happen, because if they happen, it means more will happen. When we can start doing our show in our own theater back in Chicago, where we always welcome people from Minnesota, I don't know. And when we can start going back and playing theaters like the ones we play in Minneapolis, I hope it's soon.
I hope so, too, for so many reasons. And we will have to leave it there. We have a number of other good questions, unfortunately, we didn't get to, but very good questions. I want to thank everybody for showing up on the Zoom tonight on a Friday night. You came out for this. And Peter Sagal, I can't thank you enough. You've given us so much to think about. I look forward to the update of Constitution USA now that you have a lot more to tell us, and you've been shaken, and I need to see how that continues. So, Peter Sagal,
if you know anybody over at Twin Cities Public TV, tell them I'm ready and willing.
All right, I'll mention it. I don't know anyone over there, but anyway, thank you so much. I really appreciate it, Peter. It's been
my pleasure. Thanks everybody for watching, and I hope I'll see you all soon.